Hello everyone, I welcome you all to another video by Legacy IAS where we're going to talk about how India and Japan and the friendship that we have is also got to do with some of the fundamental constitutional principles that these two countries share. Have we been influenced by them to make our own constitution? Are there some very common similar areas in which we kind of manage our country, administer our country on a day-to-day basis? And are there some fundamental areas of differences? That is all what we're going to talk about in this particular video. Extremely important for you for GS paper 2, but in general for understanding the friendship between these two countries. Now, if we look at the Indian and Japanese constitution, and particularly if we look at the evolution of this Japanese constitution, something which came up in 1889 was actually known as the Meiji Constitution. All right, this particular constitution influenced by the Prussian Constitution. All right, it was the first of a kind in Asia. How in Asia, for the very first time, a Western style constitution had been brought in. So in Japan, in that sense, did a very important task of kind of incorporating some of the elements which were there practiced in the West into its own constitution. In 1854, Japan kind of opened up its economy, something that we did in 1991. And these are points of reference as to which kind of shows as to where this country is and where are we today. And it also kind of goes back into how many years of time are we looking at in terms of opening our economies. All right, so that makes a very important difference. India has actually borrowed this very important principle of procedure established by law from the Japanese constitution. There have been several instances where this particular principle has been incorporated in our right to personal liberty, in our right to life of the Indian constitution. So in that sense, we have this important influence from the Japanese constitution into the Indian constitution system, and that's why it makes a lot of sense. So keeping these fundamental things in mind, there are some similarities that we see between the constitutions of these two countries. Both Indian and Japanese constitutions are written. All right, we have a document which kind of mentions all the articles that are there. We have a similar parliamentary form of government where we have the dependence or the coexistence, or rather the connection between the executive and the legislature. All right, and how we have a real head and a de jure or a nominal head. All right, so in that sense, there is similarity on the form in which the government is there in India and Japan. It becomes an important starting point in kind of establishing relations, in managing friendship, that we also have this kind of a system, and you are better able to understand and appreciate what happens within the government. And that is actually a true meaning in which we understand this comparative constitution, and we utilize it to understand international relations in a much better way. Both our countries play a lot of importance to fundamental rights and fundamental human rights. So here we have India actually giving so much importance after independence, and for Japan as well, after it kind of became a formal country, it also kind of gave a lot of importance to its people, how especially after the Second World War there was so much of devastation. That is where these articles also found very handy. Now, as far as the Parliament of Japan is concerned, it is also comprised of two houses. Just like in India, we have an upper house and a lower house, whereby the upper house has not as much power as the lower house, but still acts as an important deterrent in any hasty legislations that might just come. Here, the two houses are named as House of Representatives and House of Peers. The same way in which we have our upper house kind of talking about like, or kind of behaving like elders. All right, so here they have House of People in this regard. Both in Japan as well as in India, people, the public of India, are actually the ones who have the ultimate authority. They are ultimately sovereign in the entire country, and that is again a very important thing that is similar between these two countries. We have the Prime Minister as a part of the parliamentary form of government, we have the prime minister as heading the cabinet and directing the executive branch. So we have in India as well, similarly, a prime minister who's heading the council of ministers and the core committee of the council of ministers, the cabinet, and they are the ones who are basically kind of heading the way in which the government has to function and the executive branch has to function, and the prime minister is the one who's taking the final call, who's making final shots. All right, so he is heading this particular cabinet, this and the cabinet is the one who basically directs the entire executive branch. In India, the political executive and the permanent executive are both under, in some ways or the other, control of or under the supervision of the prime minister. All right, so the same way we have the entire executive in Japan under the control or under the leadership of the prime minister. Both India and Japan have single citizenship. Now, it is of course kind of possible and makes more sense for a small country like Japan, but India also manages to, and in fact, it's a requirement for India to have single citizenship to maintain the unity and integrity of India, to maintain that brotherhood. So, in that sense, single citizenship is very, very crucial for that country, and that is also a common area of similarity between the two countries. But when we move from these areas of convergences, from these similarities to some differences which are there in the constitutional system, we see that the Japanese constitution is much more rigid as compared to the Indian constitution. Now, the rigidity of the constitution lies in the way in which you amend the constitution. All right, you bring in changes to the constitution. Now, in India, we are partly flexible and partly rigid, and that depends on the on what you are trying to talk about, what you're trying to change, what you're trying to amend. All right, the areas which are easy to amend are much more flexible as compared to, and in fact sometimes they don't even require a formal process of amendment, whereas the areas which are rigid, which involve, let's say, proper federal features, amendment of federal features of the constitution, in that sense is extremely rigid. In fact, India has, or rather the Supreme Court has given the country something called the basic structure of the constitution, which cannot be altered under any circumstances. So in that sense, it's of course rigid, but there are several features which are quite flexible in terms of their amendment or change, and which is why we've had 100 plus amendments over the last years since independence. So in that sense, Japanese constitution is much more rigid as compared to the Indian constitution. Now, the court of law could exercise the judicial powers in the name of the emperor. So, here again, we have a constitutional monarchy, all right, in Japan. That is a fundamental difference with India, because India is a republic where the head of the state is elected. Here, when we speak of a monarchy, we're speaking of a titular head, we're speaking of rather a hereditary head, all right, who is not necessarily elected from the public. So even though there's democracy, but we have the emperor, and in fact the law, the court of law is in the judicial powers that are there, they are exercised in the name of this particular emperor. So we're not seeing a stark difference between, or a stark separation of power between the executive and the judiciary, executive, legislature and the judiciary, as we see in the case of India. All right, and moreover, we are seeing that all of this is actually being taken in the name of the emperor. So the constitutional monarch is kind of given importance, but of course its powers are limited. But nevertheless, the fact that you have a monarchy as compared to a republic, that is a head of the state, elected head of the state, is something of a difference between the two countries. We also have the situation whereby we look at the prime minister, who is elected by both the houses of the Japanese parliament. A major difference that we see between India and Japan, because as far as India is concerned, the election takes place of all the members of the parliament of the lower house by the people themselves, and from them, whoever is the leader of the majority party, that is invited by the president to form the government. All right, so this kind of election by the houses of the Japanese parliament is very different. In fact, we can find some similarity with the election of the Indian president, also not completely, but because there the states would also be involved. But here, the fact that they are elected particularly by the houses is a major difference between the countries, between the constitutions of the two countries. Moreover, it is not enough for a person to be a leader of the majority party as far as someone to become the prime minister of the country. Whereas for India, that is the case. You are, as a prime minister, one needs to enjoy the confidence of the lower house of the parliament and have his party, his government rather, enjoying the confidence of the lower house. So in that sense, yes, it is again a major difference in the way in which the prime minister's position is there in Japan. Japanese constitution particularly is very important and kind of controversial. Article 9 is such that Japan's constitution is basically the one prohibiting all forms of war, all right, all forms of worldwide disputes. This is also one needs to really appreciate the history a country has and how that is an important influence more than anything else in kind of shaping the future legislations and constitutions of the country. In that respect, we cannot ignore and forget the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks which took place towards the end of the Second World War, and the after effects which generations after generations have felt of that particular nuclear attack. So it kind of emanates from a certain background, and that has played a very important role. India, of course, in principle, according to some general understanding in terms of foundational principle, of course, does not really encourage or kind of not goes ahead for first strike. It never really kind of wants to initiate a war. Our background is from being a land of, let's say, Gandhi, who stood for ahimsa, but also we are more realistic in that sense that it's not like we just keep waiting for the other to strike us with open arms. We retaliate, we defend, all right, but we don't really go for second strike. So only from that sense there may be a similarity, but largely the fact that you are prohibiting war in Japan, that is not something that is there in India. India has had instances of standoffs, but also proper wars with its neighboring countries, and in that sense, it is not really something that is a point of commonality between India and Japan. So, in this regard, we have seen that there are, of course, some foundational principles that may be similar between the two countries, but there are also major differences with regards to the executive, legislative, and how the country's military is kind of organized, and that's very different from the history from the where these two countries are coming from. So in that sense, that's how we look at comparison of these two constitutional systems of India and Japan. I hope you have enjoyed the video. I hope you've benefited, and if you have, you can let us know by liking this particular video, sharing it with those who don't really know about it. Thank you so much.